Hey there, everyone, and welcome to Pour and Explore, a wine, food, and travel podcast. I'm your host, Nick Elliott, the wine guy. I'd love to be your go-to guide for all things wine, food, and the amazing places they take us. Here on Pour and Explore, we'll sip, savor, and wander through the exciting world of wine, discuss incredible cuisines, and uncover the stories behind unforgettable destinations. Each week, I'll bring you lively conversations with wine experts, chefs, travel pros, and fellow enthusiasts. We'll share practical tips, hilarious tales, and plenty of inspiration to fuel your next adventure. So grab a glass, pull up a chair, and join me as we pour, explore, and celebrate the good life. Let's dive in. All right, hello to all of my wine lovers, explorers, and curious palates. Welcome back to Pour and Explore, where we sip, savor, and get deep into the heart of wine, food, and of course, travel. I'm your host, Nick Elliott, a certified sommelier, former winemaker, and wine storyteller. Today, we're doing something special. I wanted to take you on a journey. Not one of my usual journeys where I take you to a beautiful wine country somewhere in the world and talk about wine and so on. I want to talk about the journey of a grape. The journey of a grape. From the moment it buds on the vine to the second it touches your glass, a single grape lives through an epic journey which is sensory rich and just absolutely amazing. And whether you're a wine newbie or a seasoned collector, understanding this journey will give you a whole new appreciation for what is in your glass. So, take a deep breath. Imagine the morning fog over a vineyard. You hear the buzz of bees, you smell the earth and the oak and the ferment, because this, my friends, is the story from the ground up. So let's begin. Of course, we can't talk about the journey of a grape without starting where it all begins, and that is in the vineyard. From the planting of the grapes to talking about the orientation of where the grapes are going to be depending on the sun, the morning sun, the afternoon sun, the coastal influence that you might be getting if the vineyard is near water, things like that. These are all decisions that go into your wine before the plant is even in the ground. What types of soil are we working with? Is it deep soil? Is it shallow soil? Is it limestone soil? Is it sandy soil? These are also going to determine what types of grapes that you are planting in your vineyard. These are things that we're not thinking about necessarily when we are drinking a glass of wine. But in my opinion, they should be. This should be something that you are enjoying for all of the hard work, the literal blood, sweat, and tears that go into producing a bottle of wine, let alone 10,000 bottles of wine or 100,000 bottles of wine that wind up in your glass. Before there is wine, there's a vineyard, and that vineyard is a living, breathing ecosystem. The soil, as I mentioned, the sun, the slope of the land, the climate, and we talked about the different soils, and in the wine world, we call that, it's not just the soil, it's the entire environment, we call terroir. And that is the soul of the wine. The life cycle of a grape is a very interesting one. It, just like most fruits, a grape starts with the breaking of the bud. We call it bud break here in the northern hemisphere. Bud break, depending on where you're at, starts somewhere in and around February, March, maybe April, in cooler climates, things like that. But we're going to start getting bud break in the spring, and bud break is just when that little green plant starts to grow out of the vine, and that's when life begins for a grape. Shortly after bud break, as things start to grow a little bit more, you're going to start getting into the flowering phase of the fruit growth. The flowering phase is when you're going to get little tiny flowers that grow. They don't even look like flowers per se. It looks more like like a pine cone, if you will, with little white dots on there. And an interesting thing about grapevines is they are self-pollinating. So when we are in the flowering phase, going into the fruit phase of the growth of your grape, we don't need bees or any other thing interacting with the vine in order for it to pollinate itself, because a vine will self-pollinate. And of course, during this time, as most times in the growth of a grape, weather is going to be crucial as well. There are certain temperatures that have to fall between in this time for a vine to start producing flowers, and then, of course, turning into fruit eventually. Weather is very, very important. After we start to get some fruit on the vines over the summertime, and summertime here, again in the northern hemisphere, so we're looking at July, August timing. If we go down to the southern hemisphere, places like South Africa and Chile and New Zealand, their summer is obviously opposite of us, so this just think completely opposite for the southern hemisphere. In the summer, we go through a period that's called veraison. Veraison is we start to get color on the grapes. Now, when grapes first start to form on the vine, they're all going to be like a yellowish, greenish color. And if you're dealing with a red grape, for example, Pinot Noir, we'll just again use that as my favorite example. The veraison, that's when the grapes will start to turn that light purple color, or again, depending on what grape you're growing, that dark purple color. And of course, if you're dealing with a white grape, those grapes are going to stay green or like a pale yellowish color, just depending. So that is the section of the growing period that we call veraison. And then finally, we come to the harvest. When the vineyard manager has decided that the grapes are ready to pick, along with the winemaker, they might be the same person, just depending on the business, they decide when it is time to harvest. And those decisions are made in a few different ways. Those decisions are made based on the amount of acid that is in the fruit at this time. It depends on the amount of sugar that's in the fruit at this time, how much water is in the fruit at this time. So it's very, very specific work to be able to harvest when the time comes. And it's a very, very short window in which we have to do it. So to get a crew and to get all of the equipment and everything that it takes to pick those grapes, to harvest those grapes and get them into the winery, that is very important work. And again, this is just the beginning of putting that wine into your glass. With that, imagine you're a winemaker, you're walking through the rows, tasting grapes, that's how we're making decisions. We do have some equipment, but a really good winemaker is going to be able to pop that fruit into his or her mouth and taste the sugar, taste the acid, taste the flavors, the tannins, the ripeness of those grapes. And like I said, grapes don't wait. So as soon as those grapes are ready to go, we have to hit the ground running and get into the winery, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about some growing practices in the vineyard. Of course, we all know about organic growing. That's basically going to be that we are not using any synthetic chemicals in the growing of those grapes. Nothing for fertilizer, nothing for pest abatement. We're doing it very clean, very natural, so you're not getting any synthetic pesticides or herbicides on your grapes when we're producing them. This is something that we all know. Sustainability, takes organic growing to the next level. Sustainability is going to be a focus on the long-term environmental impact and community health of your vineyard and everything that you're doing in that vineyard. And it encompasses organic growing, but it's going to focus on how are you treating your workers? Are you giving them a living wage? How are you treating your neighbors? Are you are you going around with your equipment at midnight, waking up the neighbors and things like that? These are all things that go into sustainability as well. It's basically being good stewards of the land, being good stewards of your community when it comes to the environmental impact that your vineyard has on the surrounding community. So really, really something to think about. And it's something we don't talk about a lot when we're out there and about and drinking wine and enjoying wine. But I think it's a great question for you to ask when you go into a tasting room or something, whether or not this wine was created with sustainability in mind. And then finally, another one that we can talk a little bit about is biodynamic. Biodynamic grape growing, again, encompasses a lot of what we've already talked about, but we start to get into the spiritual connection to the land, the use of compost beyond sustainability, and of course, growing along the phases of the moon. This might be something that you deeply believe in. This might be something that you believe is hogwash. It really depends on your personal thing, but a lot of people believe that biodynamic grape growing is important to what winds up in the final product of your wine. That is something to think about as well. The vineyard is a place of intention. Every choice that is made out there in the ground, the pruning of the vines, the irrigation, the amount of water that we grow, even what grows between the rows of grapes affects the final wine. And these are all things that we are thinking about when we are going through the planting and the cultivation process of a wine grape. So we've talked about everything that's happening in the vineyard at this point. We've talked about the harvest. Now that all of the grapes are picked, we are going to go and we're going to wind up in the winery. The grapes are going to be brought down or up, depending on where you are. And during this harvest time, the sacred time for a winery, for a vineyard, in many places that does start before dawn, quietly, of course. We try to, again, be as good stewards as we possibly can moving in to the vineyard. The first thing that happens when the grapes wind up in the winery is the grapes are sorted. We're going to pull out any unripe grapes or damaged fruits. We're going to do that. And then from that point, we are either going to crush the grapes or we're going to leave them whole. There are lots of different winemaking techniques that winemakers use. We're going to press the juice out of the grapes. We're going to crush them. We're going to leave them whole and start the fermentation with whole grapes. Are we going to leave the stems on? Are we going to take the stems off? These are all decisions that we are going to make as winemakers in the winery that is going to affect the final product. And again, you'll hear me say it a few more times during this episode, that every decision that is made in the vineyard, in the winery, and then after bottling is going to affect the final process or the final product, rather. For white wines, we're typically going to press the juice out of the grapes, keeping the skins and the seeds out, and we're just going to ferment the juice. For red wines, we are going to leave the skins intact, and again, whether or not you're going to crush the grapes and break the skin open, or we're going to leave them whole, that's a decision that we're going to make in the winery. And it's in the skins that we are going to find color. Of course, we're going to find flavor, and we are going to find tannin in there, and we'll talk about a little more about tannin in just a little bit. After we get that juice removed, or everything is in the tank all together again, fermenting the skins and the seeds and the stems and all of that stuff along with the juice, we are going to start the fermentation process. Fermentation, for lack of a better term, it's controlled chaos, is what it is. Fermentation is something that happens in nature every day of the week, and it's something that we as human beings have learned to harness and control with temperature, with other techniques to control the fermentation process, which is basically yeast cells that are consuming the sugar in the grape juice. Out of the yeast, we're producing alcohol, we're producing CO2, and we're also producing a little bit of heat as well that comes along with that. There's a lot of chemistry involved in winemaking. It really is a 50-50 split, if you ask me, between science and art. It really is an amazing thing to see. It's an amazing thing to do. It's an amazing thing to watch happen live and smell. Again, it's a sensory experience, and that wine are really seeing everything that's happening. So during that fermentation process, what's happening is the sugar in the grape juice is starting to lower, and the alcohol in that grape juice is starting to rise. Down with the sugar, up with the alcohol. We're controlling the heat that that fermentation is producing, typically with water, or there's a jacketed fermentation tank, which is going to be pumped full of propylene glycol, essentially antifreeze. It doesn't go in the wine. Don't get scared. It goes around the wine in a jacket, which helps cool down the fermentation. Some fermentations we do cool fermentation. We can do hot fermentation, somewhere in between. These, again, are all choices that we are making as winemakers that is going to affect the final product. Red wine is typically, as I mentioned, fermented on the skins and sometimes the stems as well, just depending on what we're doing. White wines are fermented without the skins, unless you're making orange wine. That's a very popular thing nowadays. Orange wine is essentially white wine that is being fermented on the skins to extract some of the color from those skins. And then, of course, we have rosé. Where does rosé come from? Some people think, I'm mixing a little bit of red wine with my white wine. That's not typically the case, although it does happen. That's not typically the case. What we're doing in the case of rosé is we're treating the red wine grapes like a white wine. We are literally just pressing the juice out of the red grapes, extracting the juice, and then coming along with that is some of the pigment that is in the skin of the grape, and that's what's going to give you that very, very light hue of pink or salmon color or whatever that particular grape is going to give you that very, very light hue, which makes a beautiful rosé wine. And, I mentioned there are different tanks that are jacketed, to keep the fermentation a little bit cooler. There are different types of vessels in which we will ferment our grapes. Stainless steel is what I was just talking about. It's going to produce a very fresh, a very lively red wine. A lot of white wines are produced in stainless steel nowadays to produce that very fresh, light characteristic. Of course, we can ferment in oak. That is another way to do it. When we ferment in oak, of course, you're going to pick up a lot of that richness, a lot of that vanilla character, a lot of that toasty character is another way to go about it. Amphora is another way to do it. An amphora is a clay pot, and we will use these in, again, a lot of white wine production, but there are a lot of people using them for orange wine production and even some for red wine production. So again, everything is a choice. Everything that we're choosing to do in the winery, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but everything that we choose to do in the winery, and by the way, folks, I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg on all of the things that happen in a winery that get to go into the final bottling and finally in your glass. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So everything that we're talking about today is really in hopes that you will appreciate the love and the attention and the labor that goes into producing your wine. All right, now that fermentation is done, now comes what the French call élevage. That is the raising or the nurturing of the wine after the fermentation point. Aging a great wine is a lot like aging cheese or curing meat. There are different stages of structural development, complexity development, and character development, and these are all done in the winery immediately following the fermentation fermentation process. Let's start with some of the basics. Do we oak our wine or do we not oak our wine? I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about the different types of oak and things like that and the different characteristics you're going to get from them. We can talk about that in another episode, but oak is going to give you certain characteristics to the wine, more elegant notes, maybe some spicy notes. You might get some more vanilla notes from different types of oak. And, on the opposite end of that, if you're going to then nurture the wine after fermentation in stainless steel, you're going to get some more fresh qualities and really let the qualities of the fruit, well, the wine at that point, come out of that particular wine that's already made. There are different types of processes we can do after the fermentation process. I will name a couple of them again right now. I'm not going to nerd out too much with you, so your eyes don't roll in the back of your head when we start talking about secondary fermentations and things like that. But there are two things that I think are important to talk about when it comes to after the fermentation and that nurturing of the wine. First and foremost is a process called malolactic fermentation. Malolactic fermentation is the process of converting a very sharp acid in the wine to a softer acid. We're turning malic acid, which is very sharp and biting, into lactic acid. Lactic acid is going to be more subdued, quite specifically more creamy, or what we might refer to as buttery. Here in California, we are known for our creamy or buttery Chardonnays. These are wines that have gone through the malolactic fermentation process. Again, this is a secondary fermentation, quote unquote, after the initial fermentation, which is going to knock down the acid in the wine. So instead of that, think about drinking a glass of Sauvignon Blanc and having that very, biting acid on the tip of your tongue versus drinking a creamy Chardonnay, which you're going to feel more on the sides of the tongue, and it's going to have that more buttery feel to it. And even a buttery smell in some cases, depending on the wine. It's also important to note that most red wines in the world do go through this process of malolactic fermentation, which is why, to some degree, that red wines are creamier, softer, and less biting than white wines are in a lot of cases. Another process I want to talk about during this élevage time is lees contact. I think I talked a couple weeks ago about lees and what that means. It's basically we are allowing the completed wine, the wine that's just finished fermentation, to sit on the cells, the yeast cells that are left over from the fermentation. And we call that lees, L-E-E-S. And basically what's going to happen is the aging of that wine, or the élevage of that wine on the lees, is going to add body to the wine. It's going to add some flavor to the wine. When we are stirring the lees during that secondary process, in French we call that batonnage, and that process is going to give the wine some extra texture and some extra richness. A great example of wines that pretty much always sit on the lees are any type of sparkling wine. Let's use champagne as a great example. So what's happening in that bottle is the wine is sitting on the yeast cells that are left over in the process of making that still wine, and we add a little bit more yeast and a little bit more sugar to that wine, and what's happening is that sparkling wine, that champagne, is gaining a little bit of yeastiness or breadiness, flavors or aromas rather, of brioche bread, or fresh baked muffins, or just depending on what your nose does with that particular wine. So lees contact and lees stirring is a very, very important important process to happen after fermentation. I should say that it does not happen to all wines. I would say it's going to be not an outlier, but percentage-wise, it's going to be less than half of the wines out there are going to be aged on the lees. And then we go into the process of allowing those wines to do their thing. Once these secondary processes have been done, then we just allow the wine to sit and do its thing. That can be 6 months, it can be 6 years. It's going to be all about the winemaker's vision for what they eventually want to go into that bottle. And all of these things that we've talked about up to this point, again, broken record, every decision that's made is making its way to the final product, what winds up in your glass. All right, speaking of bottling, once the wine has reached the point where it's ready to go into the bottle, and this is going to be a decision that is agonized over and tasted and retasted and so on. Typically, you'll have a whole group of people that's going to sit in the winery and say, this is ready to go, this one's not ready to go, maybe this barrel's ready to go, but this barrel's not ready to go, and these are all things, again, that we are doing, that we are slaving over and really putting our all into what's going to wind up in that bottle of wine at the very end. And then we get into the bottling portion and beyond. When we are talking about wine, we did an episode a few weeks ago about reading a wine label, and we talked a lot about wine blends. We talked about single varietal wines, Pinot Noir, it says on the bottle, what's in that bottle. It's going to be, well, here in the States, it's going to be at least 75% Pinot Noir, and, that's what's going to be on the bottle, that's what's going to be in the bottle, and so on. But when we're talking about blending, we're not necessarily just talking about blending Cab with Merlot. We're not just talking about blending Sauvignon Blanc with Albarino or whatever blend you're making. We're also talking about blending this barrel over here with this barrel over here. And we're going to blend this tank over here with this tank over there. And that's going to be the finished wine. So again, there's a lot of testing and retesting, tasting and retasting that goes along with the final product that winds up in your bottle. Once the wine is aged, that's when the blending experience, starts to come in. And again, even some single varietal wines might come from different barrels. They might even come from different parts of the vineyard, or they might come from different vineyards. These again are all these subtle nuances that go into your glass. In the blending process, and whether that's barrel to barrel or tank to tank or grape to grape, what we are looking for is a balance of acidity. We're looking for a balance of tannin. We're looking for a balance of fruit, a balance of alcohol. What a dash of Merlot can do to a heavy Cabernet Sauvignon is soften it. And here's an interesting one for you. Maybe we take a little Viognier and add it to Syrah. So we're actually taking a white wine and adding it to a red wine to soften it up a little bit. Take it from soft to give it a little more brightness, a little more acidity. So these again are things that we can do. And then once we've made all of those decisions, we have the final blend in the correct proportions. This is where the wine becomes greater than the sum of its parts. And that's when it's going to go into the bottle, and it's going to go through filtration. It's going to go through the bottling process and the corking process or the capping process in the case of sparkling wines. And then from there, the wine is going to rest in that bottle. Typically, before it's released, it's going to depend winery to winery how long it's going to allow to be aged in the bottle before it goes out. It's not going to be ready right away. In most cases, a wine will need about a month to go through the bottle shock process, which is a real thing, by the way, and be ready for labeling and capsuling and ready to be released. And once that aging process is done, that resting process is done, It's ready for a label, it's ready to go into a box, and it's ready to go to the tasting room, or it's ready to go to your favorite wine shop for you to enjoy it. And, why does this journey matter? I've now been talking for, a good 20 minutes or so about all of the things that go into producing a glass of wine. And, why does it matter? And, here's the truth. Wine is an agricultural product. It's a scientific product. It's an artistic product. Quite frankly, it's a deeply, deeply human product. Every bottle of wine tells a story. It tells the story of a place. It tells the story of a person. It tells the story of a vintage, the year that it was harvested. When you sip a glass of wine, yes, you are sipping wine, and hopefully you're enjoying it. Hopefully you are enjoying the aromas and the what it does on your tongue. I really hope you're enjoying that. But, I want you to think about the soil and the sun. I want you to think about the choices that are made, all of the thousands of choices that are made in order to get that product in your glass, and then of course, the patience and the risks, the sheer passion, that it takes to make a bottle of wine. It's what makes wine more than a drink. It's really having a living history in a bottle. So it's so very important. I hope that this has helped you gain a little more appreciation. If you didn't already have a huge amount of appreciation for wine, hopefully this has given you a little bit more to think about. And next time you open that bottle, you're going to think a little bit more deeply about what you're enjoying. So that is going to be a wrap on this episode. I really, really appreciate you being here. If you've ever thought wine was just something pretty on a glass, I do hope that this gave you a new perspective. Every sip is a story, and every bottle is a journey that has taken a long time in the making. So if you've loved this episode, of course, I would love for you to subscribe. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave me a review, and please share it with someone who loves wine, or someone who's ready to start loving wine. So hopefully we can get them started off on the right foot. Don't forget, I have a downloadable visual guide for you on the journey of a grape. So what I'd love for you to do is comment on this episode comment journey for me, and we will go ahead and send you a PDF with a nice visual representation of what the adventure a grape takes before it winds its way up in your glass. Don't forget to check out some of my trips I've got coming up. I just booked Australia and New Zealand for 2026, so make sure you head over to thewineguy.vin, www.thewineguy.vin, to check out those new trips that I have coming up. I still have a few seats left on the boat in France and Germany in November, so please check that out. That's November 2025, and that is going to be an awesome trip up the Rhone River for about 10 days, and it's going to be absolutely fantastic. So with that, until next time, folks, please keep wondering, and please keep wondering. Cheers. Thank you so much. Have an awesome, awesome rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Pour and Explore. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your stories, and your questions, so you can drop me a line at cheers@thewineguy.vin. That's cheers@thewineguy.vin. Or let's connect on TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook. Grab those links on my website at thewineguy.vin. Until next time, let's keep wondering and wandering. Cheers, everyone.